God's discipline. When we persistently disobey God, He will discipline us in order to help us live more godly lives. Here's Gene.
This is different than punishment per se. This is discipline. God's discipline is for our good, to bring us into His will when we violate His will. Judges chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and He handed them over to marauders, who raided them, and He sold them to the enemies around them so that they could no longer resist their enemies. God disciplined them. Whenever the Israelites went out, the Lord was against them and brought disaster on them, just as He had promised and sworn to them, so they suffered greatly. In other words, they violated God's will again and again, and so consequently, God did what He said would happen. That is, He allowed them to suffer the consequences. There was persistent disobedience. And that's what we see in the book of Judges. Let me just give you an overview of that. Throughout the book of Judges, we read that the Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. And there you have the specific references in verse 11 of chapter 2, 3:7, 4:1, 6:1, 8:33, 10:6, 13:1. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. And that was that cycle after restoration, once again to do evil, leading to their downfall and to this discipline that came into their lives. The discipline, and as you look at this, you will see that this discipline was in proportion to their disobedience. You see the connection. The extent of disobedience led to the extent of discipline in their lives. In Hebrews chapter 12, we read about God's discipline. But we also read about discipline that is preventative. It's not just a result of our failures, but it's preventative. And we read, "For they disciplined us for a short time," referring to our parents, "based on what seemed good to them. But God does it for our benefit so that we can share His holiness." That's the purpose of God's discipline in our lives. No discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful, and later on, however, it yields the fruit of peace and righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Now this leads to an interesting question of differentiation. And the question for reflection and response simply reads, how can we differentiate between God's discipline when we have deliberately walked out of His will? That's what Israel did. They deliberately walked out of God's will, and you see the connection between their disobedience, which was persistent, and the discipline that followed. But how do we differentiate between that kind of discipline, when we deliberately walk out of His will, and discipline that is simply meant to help us to grow spiritually? How do we differentiate that? Well, I think most of us can answer the first question because most of us are aware of our deliberate sins over a process of time. And isn't God merciful? I often say His grace rope is awfully long, but eventually, boom, He pulls us in. And we know that that happens in our lives if we are persistently disobedient. So we can draw that conclusion because that's exactly what happened to Israel. And a lot of times for us, it's just natural consequences. If we sow to the flesh, we reap corruption, as we saw earlier. But what about the fact that we're living in the will of God? As far as we know, we are living in the will of God, and yet we face what is God's discipline, the trials that come into our lives that we looked at earlier in the book of James. Well, if we are living in the will of God, we can look at that and say, God's discipline is preventative. He's preparing us. He's not disciplining us because of what we've done, but He's disciplining us to prepare us for what's to come, so that we can see His purpose, that we can draw closer to Him, that it's an opportunity for us to grow in our Christian life. And you know, it's very difficult to see that opportunity when we're in the midst of a difficult trial, a difficult situation. And one of the things that I've tried to do, which is not easy, in the midst of a difficult situation, where I don't feel that I've done something to cause this in my life, but it's happened. And one of the things I try to do is to see some meaning in it that will help me to grow and mature and to prepare me for the future. And it's amazing how when you can see some purpose, and the purpose might be the very question, why is this happening and what can it do for the future? And we can't see beyond the event, and we can't even see the future. But we can say, Lord, I want to see some meaning here that will prepare me, even if it's just that you're preparing me. Even though I can't see what's around the corner, what's around the next curve, around the next switchback. What are you preparing me for that I don't know anything about? So God, I think, in many respects, disciplines us in that way, and part of the discipline, that kind of discipline, is referred to there in Hebrews chapter 12.